Welcome back to Dominique Medici Art Academy. In the last lesson, we were looking at how you can create a sense of depth by just varying the weight of a line. And this week, we're going to go a little further. Let's jump into it. There's this wonderful expression that value does all the work, but color gets all the credit. And it's very interesting. This is one of the reasons why we spend an entire year doing proportion and value. In many ways, color makes the story interesting, but value tells the story. Some of us can remember being kids and watching black and white films, and the story itself comes through regardless of whether it was in color or not. You almost forget that color even existed, but the value itself conveys the meaning. So let's come back to our pear. Here we see our object from day 2. We're imagining we're taking a little strip off of here. Just like that. Take the little strip, take it off and pop it over. It would look something like that. Now, the gradient by itself, it's hard to work with in the sense that it's very hard to pinpoint any particular value on a gradient scale. So what's kind of nice is to break that gradient up into discernible and distinct value steps. So here we have an 11-step value scale, and it goes from 1 as the lightest light, and 11 as the darkest dark. So that already makes the value scale a lot easier to use. So if we look at our pear through that same scale, we can see the way that it breaks down, and the way that when we posterize the image of the pear, how it breaks up into these distinct value steps. But working with 11 value steps, certainly doable, and it's a lot of mixing. One of the things that we will do is be looking at the concept of Notan. What you can see is that the pear has just been broken down into 2 shapes, a light and a dark. Up until this point in our drawing, we've only been working with contour, deliberately looking only at the outside shape. And we've seen how subtle and how complex just a contour can be, and how getting proportions to get a sense of scale to read well is no small task. Right? This is why we think in these distinct steps. And once we have our proportion a little bit under control, we then can move into value. Now, one of the best ways to think about value is first to use something called Notan. So Notan is just a flat pattern of white and black. That's it. What it's looking at is what is light and what is dark. Now, in this case, it's a little tricky. There are certain parts that are obviously in shade and some parts that are obviously in light. But what about the things in the middle? Well, those are a little more tricky, but we have to make a decision. So we could, with confidence, come down through here and say, okay, everything in front looks pretty light and everything behind that line looks pretty dark. Now, what about when we get down here, where we start getting this midtone that's pretty even across the form? Well, it's midtone, but it's also reflected light. But still, as a value, it's very much in the middle. So what we can ask ourselves is that middle value closer to the light or to the dark? So in this case, we could say that it's kind of closer to the light. But where does that stop? So I feel like we could get that far and say that behind, to the right of that line, we're grouping more towards the dark. To the left of that line, we're grouping more towards the light. And from here, Well, we kind of have two choices. We could go back like this, and maybe that would be the best thing to do. Another choice would be to go a little more forward, but looking at it, this makes the most sense. So what this does is we've now broken up our form, and we'll just lightly shade this into a light shape and a dark shape. All right, just two flat shapes. So doing this is really helpful because it helps us understand the value structure. So this comes to our exercise. So when we first did Giotto's circle, it was just a contour, just a simple circle. Now we're looking at a sphere, considering a whole nother dimension, the dimension of light and shade. First, what we need to do, we'll take the lesson we learned up to this point and just look at the Notan. How do we break this down into just light and dark? So you can probably already see it. Now in this case, we have a value scale at the bottom, right? If this is our 11 and this is our 1, and the 6 is our midway point. So we could say anything that's darker than the 6 will group towards the dark, and anything lighter will group towards the light. Now that's not always the case, because depending on how light or dark the object is, right? So in this case, you can tell that this sphere is gray. I actually painted it with a number 6 gray. So using black and white paint, I mixed up the 6 and then painted the whole thing. The nice thing about that is that the highlights read well and the darkest darks read well. And the mid color on this sphere is a 6. So everything shows up really nicely. But by comparison, the tabletop and the background are probably more like a 4. And of course, the tabletop looks a bit lighter because the light is hitting it, and the background reads pretty well because it's pretty much in a mid-tone kind of range. So you can see, right, your eye totally goes to this place right here. Now, that's the natural place for us to see. Now again, we're just thinking light and dark. So even though we're seeing lighter bits within the shadow and darker bits within the shadow, you can see that they're all darker than our 6. So they group with that big shape. Same thing over here in our lights or our reflected light. It's a reflected light, but it's darker than even anything in the midtone. So it groups with the shadow shape. Putting this together, what do we get? We get something like this. One of the ways that I like to work is, first, we talk about something conceptually. We break it down. Using the iPad is great because we can do it fairly easily. And then we take this concept and we put it into practice. Okay, so let's get to the easel. This exercise is really just about getting comfortable with shading. It's a very simple exercise. So you can see this value here is an 11, so it's our darkest dark, right? And everything else has been simplified to a white. So that's the idea of Notan. It's just a pattern of black and white. So what we want to do is we want to shade in this shape here as flat and as evenly as possible. And this exercise will help us gain control over our materials and how to build up a value with consistency. That is a very important foundation or building block for ultimately rendering this sphere altogether. So I'm going to draw this line in across my sphere, and just like we do with everything else, even though it's kind of a little bit of a curve, let's see if we can't break it up into some important planes here. Looks like it's a pretty straight shot through here. And of course, as we're doing that, really the bottom of the sphere, it just is part of the cast shadow. It's all one big shape. That's what Notan does. It doesn't see the difference between forms, it groups things together. So that's what we're going to do. Even though this is a dark value, I still want us to use the HB, because what we're going to find is, we could use something like a 2B, and that would be fine, but there's something about using a lighter pencil in building up towards the dark. The slower we go, the more evenly our pattern will build up and the less likely it will get kind of blotchy and choppy. Always better slow and steady. Now I'm working, as you can see, pretty parallel to the surface of the paper. And the pencil doesn't really leave the surface so much. It's a very light touch. You can see already how you start to get some dark marks. So that's amplified when you have an even softer pencil. So until we get comfortable with both the paper as well as our pencil, it's better to just work it up slowly, little by little. So what I tend to like to do is just do it one pass at a time. So what I mean by that is I'm going kind of this level of darkness, right? It's not particularly heavy. The pressure on the pencil is very light, very, very light. Now you'll notice I went all in one direction in the first pass. Now on the second pass, I'm just gonna slightly change it. So say if the first direction was like that, maybe my second pass will be like that. So what this will do, this is sort of like cross-hatching, but it's just very slight changes for each layer. And what that should do for us is help keep the texture and the pattern very, very even and consistent. We don't want any part to stick out more than another, right? We're trying to get it to read the way it's printed, so very even, very flat. Not quite enough of a change of plane. Let me... What you might find is you might rotate your pencil just ever so slightly every now and then so that we're, in a way, we're sharpening our pencil as we're drawing. Now, the nice thing about this process is it sort of becomes like a meditation. You just enjoy the process of working layer by layer, slowly, slowly building it up. So next layer, I'm going to go in this direction. So you might find at this point that, see, this bit stands out a bit too much. Then we see there's a little bit of a line forming here. So we want to take care to maybe just fill in some of the spots that are a little too light and avoid doubling up on the spots that are already dark. So you see in this case, I'm coming right up to that line, but making sure that I don't go further so that I am not strengthening that edge that's forming. You see, at this stage, what you might find is that some bits are beginning to get darker, some bits are beginning to get lighter. And so one of the things we want to try and control is that the value builds up very evenly and we don't get the blotchiness. So one of the ways that we can kind of remedy that to some extent is you take your kneaded eraser and make a little point on it, not to be too fine, and then just carefully tap the bit that's a bit blotchy. And what you'll find is it just takes off a little bit of that layer. I'm just tapping very, very fine. Now, if you do it too hard or too rough, you'll take off too much. So what we're trying to do is just to get it to blend into the surrounding area so that this little kind of black and white pattern is much more consistent. Now, you know, there are much quicker ways to build up the value. We could use charcoal, for example, or we could use a softer pencil. But when we're learning, the goal isn't necessarily always to be the most efficient. Gaining control is the most important part. And getting comfortable with the materials is the important part. Rendering the sphere, it's not as important. The result is not so critical. But once you have the skill, well, then you can just render anything. And if we just aim for rendering the sphere, then we'll learn a lot about spheres, not necessarily enough about the process, right? It's the process that's important, and getting comfortable with the materials. So like one of the exercises we're going to be doing in some of the coming lessons is to create a value scale, right? We're creating one of these by ourselves with a pencil. So this is, you know, a little bit of a warm up for that. And once we have made a value scale, then we can look at using it. Let's just go a little further with this, maybe put a couple more layers on. I won't go all the way to that darkest dark, just because with the HB it will take a long time. And this lesson shouldn't be a 24-hour lesson. So I'll push it a little further. So at this point, we'll do one final pass, and we'll push it just a little bit darker. But what you can see is, right, there's a little bit of blotchiness, but it's pretty even in general, and that's the goal. So just to recap, we took a look at a sphere and broke it down into Notan, just white and black, the basic pattern of light and shade. So in the next lesson, we go from 2 values to 3 values. Right? With 3 values, we begin to have the feeling of form. I look forward to seeing you in the next episode, and as always, the reference for these videos is always linked in the description below.